Before we know it, Christmas will be here. And so will, perhaps even more importantly, will Human Rights Day. Human Rights Day is a hugely important date in the international calendar, and it is celebrated on the 10th of December. It was an enormous privilege ahead of this date to welcome Dr. Ruvi Ziegler to the podcast. Ruvi is an expert in refugee law and a prominent voice and advocate for refugee rights. You may agree or disagree with what Ruvi has to say, perhaps a little bit of both, but either way, you cannot deny that what Ruvi has to say is truly powerful stuff. Enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the Discover Reading podcast. We'll start off with our traditional question. Ruvi, who are you? What is your journey to where you are now, and what do you do?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Phil and Chris. I mean, I'm very glad to be able to contribute to this successful series and hopefully not drive it down. So I'm Ruvi Ziegler. I'm an associate professor in international refugee law at the university at the School of Law, where I also direct our postgraduate programs. And at the university at large, I chair our LGBT plus staff network. So my pronouns are he or him. So I have two general areas of research and advocacy, and I think one of them looks likely to feature quite strongly in this podcast, but I thought I'll flag out the other one as well. So the first, which we'll talk about at length, I think is refugees and asylum seekers. And here, my two main areas of interest were rights of refugees after they have been granted status, so post recognition, and I wrote a book on voting rights of refugees, and done quite a lot of advocacy work in that area with international organizations. The second, and very pressing and topical, sadly, is about access to asylum. It's how people can come to seek asylum in countries such as the United Kingdom. In addition to my job at Reading, I'm affiliated with the Refugee Study Centre in Oxford, with the Refugee Law Initiative at the University of London, which is an international initiative, and also co-convene the Migration and Asylum section of the UK Society of Legal Scholars. So that's one kind of big thing that I do and occupies me most of the time. But then the second area that I've primarily since the Brexit referendum have been focused on are issues concerning the rights of EU citizens and members of their family in the post-Brexit referendum arena. And in that, I kind of play two particular roles on the public in the public sphere. Rather, one is I chair the board of trustees of a charity called New Europeans UK. And in my hometown, which is Oxford, I chair the Oxford European Association. And so this is a passion of mine that's quite strong.
That's fantastic. And yeah, we're so pleased to have you on the show, Ruvi. Thanks so much for coming on. And obviously, you mentioned the one area of your research is into human rights law. And one reason we were really keen to have you on is because Human Rights Day is coming up on the 10th of December. And that's the day when the United Nations adopted in 1948 the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as we know, proclaims the inalienable rights which everyone is entitled to as a human being. So we wanted to ask you, this is a declaration and an agreed upon aspiration, but it's not a legally binding document. So from a legal point of view, how important is this declaration for the protection of human rights?
Yeah, thank you. So you are right. Of course, this is a day in the international calendar, the 10th of December. And in some way, that's already part of the answer to the question, I think, because the Universal Declaration came about at a time when, the New World Order after the Second World War was starting to form. So 2 years after the setting up of the United Nations and the UN Charter. And as such, it was, as you say, intended to be aspirational, and he wasn't setting binding obligations on states, but he was setting in place principles such as the free and equal nature of all human beings, and was also recognizing the fact that in order to have human flourishing, you both need to have access to what's referred to in the technical term as civil and political rights. So rights that relate to freedom of speech, that relate to freedom of religion, to political participation, elections, but also social and economic rights. So social security, health and education. And at that time, this is, if you think about it, for viewers in the UK, listening in the UK, this is a year before the National Health Service was introduced in the UK. So the idea that you have a right to health, for instance, wasn't at all obvious, even in global north countries or developed countries such as the UK. So the idea that you set these as benchmark for countries the world over was significant, and I think remains significant. And the thing about it being non-binding was that it was put in place whilst negotiations have already started to create binding international instruments. Sadly, because of the Cold War already brewing, those instruments have been separated initially into two, a covenant on civil and political rights and a covenant on economic and social and cultural rights, which are binding, and ultimately take the Universal Declaration and expand on it in each of these directions.
Okay, fascinating. You mentioned that you've had a binding legal framework develop alongside the non-binding legal framework. Think of the binding legal framework. How exactly is that enforced? Are there any kind of good examples which come to mind in terms of the enforcement side of things?
Yeah, well, look, that is one of the serious questions when it comes to international human rights law. So I think the short answer, human rights law doesn't have perfect enforcement or close to perfect. It's not akin to the sort of enforcement of law that you have within a domestic system. It is contingent on national jurisdictions or states doing that enforcement primarily. But that doesn't mean it's not law, and it also doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect. And I think that's important to understand, because we often hear this kind of slogan that international law is not law, and that's not the case. I think it would be wrong to suggest that it's equally effective the world over, and I think part of also the strategic force of naming and shaming, and one of the ways naming and shaming is done, by the way, is by NGOs and international organizations publishing reports where they tell states, look, you sign up to this voluntarily. You sign up to protecting the rights of women or the rights of racial minorities or the rights of people with disabilities. Why aren't you doing what you're supposed to be doing? And you've got organizations like Amnesty or like Human Rights Watch who do that. And when they do that, they try to target, I think, and sometimes people think it's disproportionate, but they try to target actually more developed democracies. And the reason is that they think that it will be more effective to name and shame countries where there is a public discourse around human rights, where there is accountability, sometimes to parliaments. So you would often get, like in this country, you would have members of parliament quoting reports from organizations when they put urgent questions or other forms of questioning to ministers. And then ministers have to explain the government's action. And that creates a bit of a discourse around rights. It is also the case that governments don't like this naming and shaming. And so they often try to mischaracterize, I would say, or human rights organizations as, the defenders of terrorists or the defenders of nasty people, because they want to discredit the work that they do when they highlight infractions or violations of human rights. And that is an uphill battle that human rights advocates are faced with all the time.
And one area we did want to ask you about, as you said in your introduction, that you do specialise in the rights of refugees. And actually, a Declaration of Human Rights does have Article 14 that refers specifically to the rights of refugees. Chris, first of all, could you just give us a bit of background to what Article 14 is?
Simply put, Article 14 states that everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. However, in reality, many people are only happy to support this concept so long as obviously it doesn't impinge upon their everyday life, Good example of this is, of course, the tragic situation in Afghanistan. Priti Patel goes onto the TV and says we can't accommodate 20,000 Afghan refugees in one go. So this is a contentious issue for many. But in your viewpoint, Ruvi, how many refugees is it actually reasonable and feasible for a country to accommodate? Are we talking about it, say, being 1,000? We're talking about it being 100,000, a million? Is it actually possible to put a number on these on these things? So yeah, what are your thoughts on this issue and the level of responsibility which country A has for welcoming asylum seekers to the nation?
Yeah, so this is obviously a fraught question, and as you said, very politically contentious. And I think one initial way to get into thinking about this question is actually to look at numbers and to put situations like the one the UK is in, I think, a more realistic context than the one the Home Secretary and others do. So globally, there are 27 million refugees, people that the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees would classify as refugees, out of a population of 8 billion people. So you already see that if they were equitably distributed the world over, this is not a very sizable part of each other member state which doesn't host refugees and isn't a refugee producing but could be a refugee receiving country. The reality is that of those 27 million, the vast majority, over 85%, are actually hosted in countries in the global south, mostly neighboring countries to countries like Afghanistan, that would be Iran or Pakistan, to countries like Somalia, it would be Kenya, to countries like the DRC, the people would end up in Sudan, to countries like Colombia, it would be Venezuela, countries like Myanmar, it would be Thailand or Bangladesh. And so if we look at the top 5 refugee hosting countries, only one of them is in the global north, and that is Germany. And that is due to a decision that was controversial, but in my view also courageous by the former Chancellor Angela Merkel to allow people who have crossed into the European Union space to make it to Germany and not have to stop at the first European country they have entered. So Germany is in the top 5, but the other ones are Turkey, Pakistan, Uganda, and Sudan. And if you go further down the list, you go down past number 10 and past number 20 and past number 30, you will still not find the UK. The UK received last year 27,000 asylum seekers. I think the calculation per constituency is about 40. Right, so and actually the peak in the UK in terms of numbers dates back to the early 2000s, when you had a double whammy of Afghanistan in the first iteration and Iraq, and even then the numbers in the UK were actually fairly low. So I think the first thing to note when we talk about it in places like the UK is that the UK is an island on the northwest end of Europe, quite hard to reach. There are no safe and legal routes to it. And so it's not a surprise that most refugees in the world don't end up in the UK. The last point I would make by way of kind of entry into this topic is that the Refugee Convention doesn't have a quota system. So there is no absolute number. You don't say, I'm sorry, you may have a valid protection claim, but you are the 100,001 refugee, and so we're sending you back. There is no quota system. But also, and more troublingly, right, there is no system for equitable responsibility sharing between states within the refugee system. The one region in the world which tried to put in place a temporary system like that a few years ago was the European Union, where he tried to relieve the pressure on Greece and Italy in the first kind of wave of arrivals from Syria. And that has found quite a lot of resistance, particularly from Central and Eastern European countries. And so a permanent mechanism is in the offing. I mean, the European Commission wants it to come into place, but it hasn't come about yet. So no region in the world has equitable distribution, and the world at large doesn't. But the consequence of that, and I come back to the first point, the consequence of this lack of equitable distribution isn't that Western or global North countries are the ones bearing the brunt. It's actually the reverse. It's that the countries who are bearing the brunt are those who are least capable financially and otherwise to sustain it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think often that isn't recognised, certainly in the media in the UK.
One question which I've been thinking about is often when you hear a discussion and debate about intervention, such as we saw in Libya and we've seen in Syria, is it's almost as if we don't always take into the equation the fact that once you intervene, arguably you have a moral responsibility towards the people of those nations in which you've become military entangled, and you've seen that come to the fore in Afghanistan, right, as well. So do you think that essentially once the UK, once the US, and once those partners have intervened in a country and they have changed the political and the status quo, do you think those nations bear a particular responsibility towards the people of that nation based upon the intervention?
Yes, I think that's a really fascinating question, as you say, and it's to some extent more, at least in the present state of the law, it's more of a political, social, and normative question than it is, strictly speaking, a legal question. So to some extent, if somebody is a refugee within the meaning of the Refugee Convention and they end up in the United Kingdom in whichever way, they should be granted status irrespective of whether the UK was involved in them becoming a refugee or not. This is a separate obligation. However, I do think from a moral perspective, the idea that you intervene and then you wash your hands away from the consequences, and in particular, I think there is something morally unsavory, perhaps even repugnant about causing displacement and then closing off the routes to safe protection from those spaces, letting only people who are directly helping you, for instance, as the UK has done, but not letting in others. And in fact, and I think this is a pertinent point to mention this, there is a bill being debated in Parliament, brought by the current Home Secretary, called the Nationality and Borders Bill. And what it does is it attempts to create something which is in full breach of the Refugee Convention, which is a categorization of refugees, not based on their grounds for protection, but based on their method of arrival in the UK, essentially creating a deserving and undeserving set of refugees. In fact, even the legislation called them Group 1 and Group 2 refugees. And I think we have to see those two in tandem, right? Because the UK is perfectly happy to intervene in places beyond its borders, but is far less happy to then also share the responsibility for the displacement that is caused in other places globally. I should say in the early 2000s, I think the approach was somewhat different. And there is a reason why, as I said, in the early 2000s, the numbers in the UK were higher, and they were particularly high from places where the UK was intervening. So places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So perhaps in other times, the notion that there is a heightened form of responsibility was more popular. I'm afraid, I think today that does seem to be waning.
Yeah, that's sad to hear. And me and Chris were talking about perhaps some part of the reason for that is that obviously debates around migration are very politically charged topics. Do you feel that there's a tendency, particularly in the media, to kind of conflate general debates around migration with the obligations towards asylum seekers and refugees or forced migrants, and that those two things are being forced together as one debate?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's very little doubt that certain political forces do that. I mean, I think we all remember, and I mentioned earlier, Brexit. We all remember the poster that the Leave.eu campaign put out just a week before the Brexit referendum, called Breaking Point, where the idea was to try and suggest that the UK is in breaking point in terms of the number of people coming in from the European Union, but in fact the picture was portraying a stream of refugees trying to cross into Hungary from Serbia initially coming from Iraq and Syria. And so it was an intentional ploy, as you were, to conflate refugee questions and general questions around immigration. And I think the other way in which this is done in the discourse is to not separate the numbers, right? And to kind of bring in refugee numbers. So if you told people the UK is only receiving 27,000 people a year, right? We all remember David Cameron talking about lowering net immigration under 100,000. It's always seen as part of the wider kind of batch or tranche around migration. And I think this is the more pernicious, you can say this is the previous point is more of an accounting point, but the more pernicious bit is that there is at the same time a claim that the refugee definition is too broad and too many people can come here who are not really refugees but are economic migrants. But then they also somehow are the ones who are taking up jobs that otherwise should be taken up by British people. But the reality is, if somebody comes in as an asylum seeker, they have no right to work. So even as a matter of law, that cannot happen. And of course, we now, in this country at least, we now have a job shortage. A country like Germany, having let in a very large number of refugees in 2015, 2016. I mean, it did so for moral reasons and for legal reasons. But actually, The Economist has, assessed this and said this was a great boon for Germany from an economic perspective. So I suppose the final point I would make is I think it's very difficult in the discourse to distinguish. And I sometimes wonder, and it's more like a reflective point now for human rights and refugee advocates, whether one should just, in a sense, accept it and reverse the narrative or reclaim it and say, well, look, I mean, there is nothing wrong with people seeking to migrate to other countries. Some cases, people have no choice. Those are forced migrants. But whether they are forced migrants or whether they are voluntary migrants, migration is beneficial to countries, and we shouldn't scapegoat migrants for failings of existing states. But that's, of course, a bigger and deeper debate.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings us on to our other question, actually, because you mentioned about the rights of asylum seekers and refugees and, not having the right to work and different aspects of in the country that they end up in. And we noticed that you had written about the need for marginalised groups, including refugees, to be given the right to vote in your research. And we just wanted to explore that a bit. So to play kind of devil's advocate, you can imagine someone saying, well, we've let someone flee persecution and find refuge in our country. Why should we then sort of give them the vote as well? Is that going too far? So could you talk us through why you believe it's so important to give refugees the right to vote?
No, absolutely. Thank you. And that, as you said, it is something I've written on my book, Voting Rights of Refugees, and some of the claims there extend beyond refugees, and I'll come to that. The first thing to say about voting more generally is that voting is not a prize to be given for good behavior, or it's not intended to be a trade-off with you've been given food and shelter, so you shouldn't have the right to vote, or vice versa. A right to vote reflects having a stake in a community where you are or to which you belong. And ordinarily, most people who have the right to vote are citizens of their state, and so they are full members of their political community. The situation refugees find themselves in is refugees are unable to be full members of their original political community. They cannot, by definition, as being refugees, return to that country. So they don't have that right, which in the COVID era we saw is so important for citizens, that there is, even when gates of other countries are shut, your own country will always have to accept you back, albeit sometimes under certain restrictions, even in the COVID context. Refugees can't return, so they can't come back to their country and be part of that community. They also can't turn to their country for protection when they are abroad. That country is no longer a country that provides them effective protection. That is why they were recognized as refugees. And ultimately, they're then left voiceless in both of their spaces, and that affects their dignities, their self-worth, their notion of belonging. Now, you could say, well, if this was for a fixed period of time, if we knew we are accepting somebody, we're giving somebody shelter or refuge, as your question suggests, and we know this is only for the next 6 months and then they can come back, then of course the need wouldn't arise. Because perhaps there wouldn't even be an election within that period or within a couple of years. The problem with refugee status is that it is by definition an indeterminate status. So I'll give you 2 examples. Compare the situation of somebody who fled the Iranian regime to the UK in the late 1970s after the fall of the Shah and the Islamic Revolution, and they were persecuted by the Islamic Revolution, and compare that to somebody who fled Kosovo in 1998 when Slobodan Milosevic was mounting the attack on Kosovo. The Kosovar could return to Kosovo 3-4 years later, and there is now an independent state of Kosovo. The person who fled from Iran can still not return because the Islamic Revolution is still a place where they feel unsafe. But at the time when they were given the status of refugee, the country that gave them the right as refugee, they didn't know how long they'll have to be refugees for. And so the idea here is that you come to a new space, you can no longer count on your old space, although you may very well want to return to that space in future. And there is a potential, therefore, that for a very long period of time, you will remain voiceless and without political influence. Now, you might say, well, the best solution is for them to become citizens of their new countries of asylum. The problem with that is, and that isn't something I would object to, of course, the problem is that in some instances, countries in the world don't allow you to have more than one nationality. So that would mean that they will forever sever their ties with their country of origin. So imagine that person from Kosovo would have lost their Kosovar identity. But it's also the case that countries may not want to automatically give citizenship because that then ties them to that person permanently. Whereas the right to vote doesn't tie you permanently. It is something, if you're thinking about it on a local authority level, it is something that travels with you. If you moved from Reading to Exeter, you would stop voting in Reading and you would start voting in Exeter. And we don't see this as a strange phenomenon.
I think that's very persuasive arguments, definitely. And I was wondering whether you think that if refugees were given the right to vote in different countries, then that would change things and that political parties would need to open up more of a dialogue with them and take more of a stance on it. And perhaps things would be, as you say, a bit clearer. It's sometimes when we don't understand all the different figures and the numbers of how many refugees different countries are taking. But if refugees did have the vote, then perhaps things would become a bit clearer in that way, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I talked earlier, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I talked earlier about the more self-worth, intrinsic dignity element of why somebody would want to have a right to vote. But of course, the other important component is you vote because you wish to protect your group's interest. This is not something that is, to be condemned. This is how democracies work. This is how we value different interest groups. You look for the pensioner vote, or you look for the young vote, or you look for the ethnic minority vote, or you look for the parent vote. And this is how political parties work. And this is how contention in democracy operates. And so I think you're absolutely right in your instinct, in my view, that one of the difficulties today is that those who dislike refugees or migrants, of course, do vote, and those who are themselves refugees or migrants don't vote. And so naturally, a political party campaigning in this area would, from an instrumental perspective, want to cajole one group and not cajole the other. And that may create a bit of a balancing in the discourse as well.
And we're coming to the end of this episode now, and we do like to end things on a positive note, but the pursuit of human rights law, it can sometimes feel like an uphill struggle without any high-profile victories, and we do hear about political dissidents languishing in prisons, and there's that sense that there's no change and you can't do anything about it. But we did see that you co-authored a letter to the Israeli Attorney General, which implored him not to authorize plans to forcibly deport Eritrean and Sudanese asylum seekers from Israel, that did have a positive result. So we wanted to ask you a bit more about that and any other kind of human rights law successes that we should know about.
Yeah, well, look, so on the specific letter, yes, absolutely. I've followed and written extensively on the treatment of asylum seekers in Israel. And Israel, at a certain period of time in the late 2000s, had spontaneous arrivals, primarily people from Eritrea and Sudan who were seeking protection. And for several years, the state was trying to find ways to incentivize them to leave, including through forms of detention, different guises. And so the state was trying to find a different solution. A different solution he was looking for, in many ways, following the so-called Australian model, and perhaps something the UK may try to adopt as well, which is to try and reach an agreement with some other country, somewhere else, not a country that even the people who have come to Israel pass through, in this case, Uganda and Rwanda, try to reach an agreement with them so they would deal with Eritrean and Sudanese refugees instead of Israel. And not really put this as a choice, but rather deport people to those countries if they refuse to go willingly. And we, when I say we, I co-authored the letter, but then got over 50 immigration and international refugee law academics from really the whole of the world, imploring the Attorney General not to authorize this action because of the breaches both of international refugee law, but also of international human rights law obligations, and to some extent of Israeli law directly as well. And that, as you said, was successful in the sense that it ultimately helped the court force the state into calling off that mission. It was also potentially, we talked earlier today about naming and shaming. The fact that we were able to flag up the reports were suggesting these are Rwanda and Uganda, even though the state, Israel, would not name them because it didn't want to create a public pressure internationally, had the effect of creating that pressure. So there were demonstrations, next to the Rwandan embassy in London, and it did succeed. And there are similar cases, right, in other jurisdictions, including in the UK, of human rights lawyers succeeding in stopping unlawful deportations of people, detainees to Afghanistan, to the Afghani regime in the 2000s. The handing over of people to the US without guarantees that they would not be subject to the death penalty, for instance. So that has been stopped by court. Generally, the idea that there is now a global prohibition on torture, and that extends not just to you not being able to torture in your own country, but also not being able to hand over people to someone else to do the torturing for you, if you will. So all of these sorts of victories in this particular area have come through civil society, academia, advocates, and ultimately the courts in many developed and developing democracies. And so the fight is often an uphill battle. And I'll conclude by, referencing it again. The Nationality and Borders Bill, which is pending in this country, is a bill that, if it ends up passing in its current proposed form, will be regressive in terms of the UK's commitment to refugee law, but also will lead inevitably to many legal challenges in the courts, and those will have to be brought by people who haven't given up, right? Who still think that there is a fight worth fighting. So I do my little bit mostly in academia, although I'm not ruling out in future also qualifying myself to be able to do this through other routes. But I certainly implore people, not just in the UK but globally, to join the good fight.
No, I think that's fantastic. And as we said, often you don't hear about these victories and the fact that things can have an effect and be very, very worthwhile doing. So, yeah, really good to hear about that. Thank you. I think we'll wrap things up in a second. But Chris, do you have any final questions for Ruvi at all?
Not from my end. I thought that was outstanding. So just a massive thank you, Ruvi.
Well, I really enjoyed this, and thank you very much for organizing it, for in advance for editing and putting this to good use.
No problem. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks a lot. That was a superb episode, with Ruvi giving us a very clearly explained background to the Declaration of Human Rights, and also some hard facts and persuasive arguments around asylum policies and the rights of refugees. We hope that proved to be a stimulating discussion for you on the lead up to Human Rights Day. Next up on the podcast, we'll be speaking to Professor Shakti Vayapuri and also Dr. Alistair McNeish about cardiovascular health, snake bites, and also the importance of teaching and spreading the knowledge of science to the younger generations. Until then, take care.